The history of New York begins around 10,000 BC, when the first Native Americans arrived. By 1100 AD, New York's main native cultures, the Iroquois and Algonquin, had developed. European discovery of New York was led by the French in 1524 and the first land claim came in 1609 by the Dutch. As part of New Netherland, the colony was important in the fur trade and eventually became an agricultural resource thanks to the patroon system. In 1626 the Dutch bought the island of Manhattan from Native Americans. In 1664, England renamed the colony New York. After the Duke of York, New York City gained prominence in the 18th century as a major trading port in the 13 colonies. New York played a pivotal role during the American Revolution and subsequent war. The Stamp Act Congress in 1765 brought together representatives from across the 13 colonies to form a unified response to British policies. The Sons of Liberty were active in New York City to challenge British authority. After a major loss at the Battle of Long Island, the Continental Army suffered a series of additional defeats that forced a retreat from the New York City area, leaving the strategic port and harbor to the British Army and Navy as their North American base of operations for the rest of the war. The Battle of Saratoga was the turning point of the war in favor of the Americans, convincing France to formally ally with them. New York's Constitution was adopted in 1777, and strongly influenced the United States Constitution. New York City was the national capital at various times between 1785 and 1790, where the Bill of Rights was drafted. Albany became the permanent state capital in 1797. In 1787, New York became the 11th state to ratify the United States Constitution. New York hosted significant transportation advancements in the 19th century, including the first steamboat line in 1807, the Erie Canal in 1825, and America's first regularly scheduled rail service in 1831. These advancements led to the expanded settlement of western New York and trade ties to the Midwest settlements around the Great Lakes. Due to New York City's trade ties to the South, there were numerous Southern sympathizers in the early days of the American Civil War, and the mayor proposed secession. Far from any of the battles, New York ultimately sent the most men and money to support the Union cause. Thereafter, the state helped create the Industrial Age and consequently was home to some of the first labor unions. During the 19th century, New York City became the main entry point for European immigrants to the United States. Beginning with a wave of Irish during their Great Famine, millions came through Castle Clinton in Battery Park before Ellis Island opened in 1892 to welcome millions more, increasingly from Eastern and Southern Europe. The Statue of Liberty opened in 1886 and became a symbol of hope. New York boomed during the Roaring Twenties, before the Wall Street crash of 1929, and skyscrapers expressed the energy of the city. New York City was the site of successive tallest buildings in the world from 1913 to 74. The buildup of defense industries for World War II turned around the state's economy from the Great Depression, as hundreds of thousands worked to defeat the Axis powers. Following the war, the state experienced significant suburbanization around all the major cities, and most central cities shrank. The thruway system opened in 1956, signaling another era of transportation advances. Following a period of near bankruptcy in the late 1970s, New York City renewed its stature as a cultural center, attracted more immigration, and hosted the development of new music styles. The city developed from publishing to become a media capital over the second half of the 20th century, hosting most national news channels and broadcasts. Some of its newspapers became nationally and globally renowned. The state's manufacturing base eroded with the restructuring of industry, and the state transitioned into service industries. The September 11 attacks of 2001 destroyed the World Trade Center, killing almost 3,000 people. They were the largest terrorist attacks on United States soil. Prehistory. The first peoples of New York are estimated to have arrived around 10,000 BC. Around 800 AD, Iroquois ancestors moved into the area from the Appalachian region. The people of the Point Peninsula complex were the predecessors of the Algonquin peoples of New York. By around 1100, the distinct Iroquoian-speaking and Algonquin-speaking cultures that would eventually be encountered by Europeans had developed. The Five Nations of the Iroquois League developed a powerful confederacy about the 15th century that controlled territory throughout present-day New York, into Pennsylvania around the Great Lakes. For centuries, the Mohawk cultivated maize fields in the lowlands of the Mohawk River, which were later taken over by Dutch settlers at Schenectady, New York when they bought this territory. The Iroquois nations to the west also had well-cultivated areas and orchards. The Iroquois established dominance over the fur trade throughout their territory, bargaining with European colonists. Other New York tribes were more subject to either European destruction or assimilation within the Iroquoian Confederacy. Situated athwart major native trade routes in the northeast and positioned between French and English zones of settlement, the Iroquois were intensely caught up with the onrush of Europeans, which is also to say that the settlers, whether Dutch, French or English, were caught up with the Iroquois as well. Algonquin tribes were less united among their tribes. They typically lived along rivers, streams, or the Atlantic coast. But both groups of natives were well-established peoples with highly sophisticated cultural systems. These were little understood or appreciated by the European colonists who encountered them. The natives had a complex and elaborate native economy that included hunting, gathering, manufacturing, and farming, and were a mosaic of Native American tribes, nations, languages, and political associations. The Iroquois usually met at an Onondaga in northern New York, which changed every century or so, where they would coordinate policies on how to deal with Europeans and strengthen the bond between the five nations. Pre-colonial period. In 1524, Giovanni da Verrazzano, an Italian explorer in the service of the French crown, explored the Atlantic coast of North America between the Carolinas and Newfoundland, including New York Harbor and Narragansett Bay. On April 17, 1524, Verrazzano entered New York Bay, by way of the strait now called the Narrows into the northern bay, which he named Santa Margarita, in honor of the King of France's sister. Verrazzano described it as a vast coastline with a deep delta in which every kind of ship could pass, and he adds that it extends inland for a league and opens up to form a beautiful lake. This vast sheet of water swarmed with native boats. He landed on the tip of Manhattan and perhaps on the furthest point of Long Island. Verrazzano's stay in this place was interrupted by a storm which pushed him north towards Martha's Vineyard. Esteban Gomez was a Portuguese captain commissioned by Charles I of Spain to find a northern passage to the Spice Islands. In 1525 he sailed a caravel, La Annunciada, north from Cuba to Nova Scotia. During this voyage he entered New York Harbor and the Hudson River. In 1535, Jacques Cartier, a French explorer of Breton origin, became the first European to describe and map the St. Lawrence River from the Atlantic Ocean, sailing as far upriver as the site of the present-day city of Montreal. This river forms the northern boundary of part of the present-day state of New York. Jacques Cartier State Park is located in St. Lawrence County, New York on the south bank of the St. Lawrence River. In 1609, Samuel de Champlain, the father of New France, became the first European to map Lake Champlain, which forms part of New York's eastern border. Dutch and British colonial period. On April 4, 1609, Henry Hudson, an English explorer in the employ of the Dutch East India Company, departed Amsterdam in command of the ship Halve Mayen. On September 3 he reached the estuary of the river that initially was called the Mauritius, and was later named for him, the Hudson River. He was not the first European to discover the estuary, though, as it had been known since the 1524 voyage of Verrazzano. Hudson sailed into the upper bay on September 11. The following day he began a journey up what is now known as the Hudson River. Over the next 10 days his ship ascended the river, reaching a point about where the present-day capital of Albany is located. While exploring the river, Hudson had traded with several native groups, mainly obtaining furs. His voyage was used to establish Dutch claims to the region and to the fur trade that prospered thereafter. A trading post was established at Albany in 1614. In 1540 French traders from New France built a chateau on Castle Island near present-day Albany. Due to flooding, it was abandoned the next year. In 1614, the Dutch under the command of Hendrik Courchia-Anson rebuilt the French chateau, which they called Fort Nassau. Fort Nassau was the first Dutch settlement in North America, and was located along the Hudson River in present-day Albany. The small fort served as a trading post and warehouse. Located on the Hudson River floodplain, the rudimentary fort was washed away by flooding in 1617, and abandoned for good after Fort Orange was built nearby in 1623. By a surprise attack with overwhelming force, the English conquered New Netherland in 1664. Lenient terms of surrender most likely kept local resistance to a minimum. The colony and city were both renamed New York after its new proprietor, James II of England, who was the Duke of York and Duke of Albany at the time. The population of New Netherland at the time of English takeover was 7,000–8,000. Province of New York. Large manors were developed along the Hudson River by elite colonists during the 18th century, including Livingston, Cortland, Phillipsburg, and Rensselaerswyck. The manors represented more than half of the colony's undeveloped land. The province of New York thrived during this time, its economy strengthened by Long Island and Hudson Valley agriculture. In conjunction with trade and artisanal activity at the port of New York, the colony was a breadbasket and lumber yard for the British sugar colonies. In the Caribbean, New York's population grew substantially during this century. From the first colonial census to the last, the province grew ninefold, from 18,067 to 168,007. Revolution. New York played a pivotal role in the Revolutionary War. The act exacerbated the depression the province experienced after unsuccessfully invading Canada in 1760. Even though New York City merchants lost out on lucrative military contracts, the group sought common ground between the king and the people. However, compromise became impossible as of April 1775. Battles of Lexington and Concord. Two powerful families had for decades assembled colony-wide coalitions of supporters. With few exceptions, men long associated with the Delancey faction went along when its leadership decided to support the crown, while members of the Livingston faction became patriots. New York's strategic central location and port made it key to controlling the colonies. The British assembled the century's largest fleet. At one point 30,000 British sailors and soldiers anchored off Staten Island. General George Washington barely escaped New York City with his army in November 1776. General Sir William Howe was successful in driving Washington out, but erred by expanding into New Jersey. By January 1777, he retained only a few outposts near New York City. The British held the city for the duration, using it as a base for expeditions against other targets. In October 1777, American General Horatio Gates won the Battle of Saratoga, later regarded as the war's turning point. Had Gates not helped, the rebellion might well have broken down. Losing Saratoga would have cost the entire Hudson-Champlain corridor, which would have separated New England from the rest of the colonies and split the future Union. Statehood of the Civil War. Upon war's end, New York's borders became well defined. The counties east of Lake Champlain became Vermont and the state's western borders were settled by 1786. Many Iroquois supported the British. Many were killed during the war, others went into exile with the British. Those remaining lived on 12 reservations. By 1826 only 8 reservations remained, all of which survived into the 21st century. The state adopted its constitution in April 1777, creating a strong executive and strict separation of powers. It strongly influenced the federal constitution a decade later. Debate over the federal constitution in 1787 led to formation of the groups known as Federalists, mainly downstaters, who supported a strong national government, and Anti-Federalists, mainly upstaters who opposed large national institutions. In 1787, Alexander Hamilton, a leading Federalist from New York and signatory to the Constitution, wrote the first essay of the Federalist Papers. He published and wrote most of the series in New York City newspapers in support of the proposed United States Constitution. Anti-Federalists were not swayed by the arguments, but the state ratified it in 1788. In 1785, New York City became the national capital and continued as such on and off until 1790. George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States in front of Federal Hall in 1789. The United States Bill of Rights was drafted there, and the United States Supreme Court sat for the first time. From statehood to 1797, the legislature frequently moved the state capital between Albany, Kingston, Poughkeepsie, and New York City. Thereafter, Albany retained that role. In the early 19th century, New York became a center for advancement in transportation. In 1807, Robert Fulton initiated a steamboat line from New York to Albany, the first successful enterprise of its kind. By 1815, Albany was the state's turnpike center, which established the city as the hub for pioneers migrating west to Buffalo and the Michigan Territory. In 1825 the Erie Canal opened, securing the state's economic dominance. Its impact was enormous. One source stated, linking the Atlantic Ocean and the Great Lakes, the canal was an act of political will that joined the regions of the state, created a vast economic hinterland for New York City, and established a ready market for agricultural products from the state's interior. In that year, western New York transitioned from frontier to settled area. By this time, all counties and most municipalities had incorporated, approximately matching the states as organized today. In 1831, the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad started the country's first successful regularly scheduled steam railroad service. Advancing transportation quickly led to settlement of the fertile Mohawk and Genesee valleys and the Niagara frontier. Buffalo and Rochester became boomtowns. Significant migration of New England Yankees to the central and western parts of the state led to minor conflicts with the more settled Yorkers. More than 15% of the state's 1850 population had been born in New England. The western part of the state grew fastest at this time. By 1840, New York was home to 7 of the nation's 30 largest cities. During this period, towns established academies for education, including for girls. The western area of the state was a center of progressive causes, including support of abolitionism, temperance, and women's rights. Religious enthusiasms flourished and the Church of Latter-day Saints was founded in the area by Joseph Smith and his vision. Some supporters of abolition participated in the Underground Railroad, helping fugitive slaves reach freedom in Canada or in New York. In addition, in the early 1840s the state legislature and Governor William H. Seward expanded rights for free blacks and fugitive slaves in New York. In 1840 the legislature passed laws protecting the rights of African Americans against Southern slave catchers. One guaranteed alleged fugitive slaves the right of a jury trial in New York to establish whether they were slaves. and another pledged the aid of the state to recover free blacks kidnapped into slavery. In 1841, Seward signed legislation to repeal a 9-month law that allowed slaveholders to bring their slaves into the state for a period of 9 months before they were considered free. After this, slaves brought to the state were immediately considered freed, as was the case in some other free states. Seward also signed legislation to establish public education for all children, leaving it up to local jurisdictions as to how that would be supplied. New York culture bloomed in the first half of the 19th century. In 1809, Washington Irving wrote the satirical A History of New York under the pen name Diedrich Knickerbocker, and in 1819 he based Rip Van Winkle and the Legend of Sleepy Hollow in Hudson Valley towns. Thomas Cole's Hudson River School was established in the 1830s by showcasing dramatic landscapes of the Hudson Valley. The first baseball teams formed in New York City in the 1840s, including the New York Knickerbockers. Professional baseball later located its Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. Saratoga Race Course, an annual summer attraction in Saratoga Springs, opened in 1847.